Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Émile Rousseau pulled his wagon up to what was supposed to be his new home. The ranch house stood exactly as the deed described. 2 stories, wraparound porch, painted white with green shutters. What the deed hadn't mentioned were the 3 enormous women sitting on his front porch, each one built like a mountain and staring at him with the intensity of hawks circling prey. The tallest one, easily 6.5 feet with arms like tree trunks, stood first. Her voice boomed across the yard like thunder rolling down a canyon. Well, look what the wind blew in, sisters. She stepped down from the porch, her boots making the wooden steps groan under her weight. Behind her, the other 2 rose in unison, one with fiery red hair that seemed to catch flame in the sunlight, the other dark-haired with shoulders that could carry a plow horse. All 3 wore black dresses that had seen better days, but their eyes held a sharpness that made Émile's hand instinctively move toward the rifle on his wagon seat. The red-haired one crossed her arms and smiled, but it wasn't a welcoming smile. "Name's Bernadette Thornfield," the tallest announced, pointing a finger the size of a railroad spike at Émile. "These are my sisters-in-law, Marguerite and Céleste. Our husbands built this place with their own hands, bled for every board and nail." Her voice dropped to a growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "They died in the mine collapse last winter, but we ain't going nowhere. This land knows our sweat, our tears, our prayers." Émile climbed down from his wagon slowly, keeping his movements calm and measured. He'd dealt with claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, but never anything quite like this. The deed in his jacket pocket felt suddenly fragile, like a piece of paper against a mountain storm. "Ladies, I understand your attachment to this place, but I have legal ownership papers signed and sealed. I paid fair price for this ranch." His French accent made the words sound softer than he intended, and all 3 women exchanged glances that made his stomach tighten. Céleste, the dark-haired one, stepped forward with surprising grace for someone her size. When she spoke, her voice carried a sweetness that somehow made her words more terrifying than if she'd shouted. "Oh, sweet Émile, yes, we know your name, sugar. We know everything about you. Single man, no family, came here looking for a fresh start." She reached out and touched his cheek with fingers that could probably crush walnuts. "Well, you found more than you bargained for. See, we've decided you're going to marry us, all 3 of us. Welcome to your new life, husband." 3 months earlier, Émile had stood in the lawyer's office in San Francisco, staring at the deed that promised him salvation. His pockets held the last of his gold from the California claims, enough to buy a ranch in Colorado territory and start over where nobody knew about the mine accident, the men who died under his watch, or the guilt that followed him like a shadow. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles, had assured him the property was clean, no liens, no complications. "Previous owners deceased," he'd said matter-of-factly. "Mining accident. Tragic, but these things happen out here." The journey to Colorado had taken 2 weeks of hard riding and sleeping under stars that seemed too bright, too close, like eyes watching his every move. Émile had grown up on his grandfather's stories of the American frontier, tales of men who could reinvent themselves simply by riding far enough west. His grandfather had been a fur trapper, a man who understood that sometimes the only way to heal was to find a place where your past couldn't follow. The old man's voice echoed in Émile's memory as he rode. "The land doesn't care what you've done, boy. It only cares what you're willing to give it." When Émile first saw the ranch from the ridge above, his heart had lifted for the first time in months. The house sat in a valley green with spring grass, with a creek running clear and bright along the eastern border. Cattle dotted the pasture, good stock from the look of them, and the barn stood solid and well-maintained. It looked like the kind of place where a man could build something lasting, something clean. He'd imagined himself working the land, maybe eventually finding a wife in town, raising children who would never know the weight of their father's failures. But even as hope bloomed in his chest, something had felt wrong about the silence. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool morning air. No dogs came running to bark at the approaching stranger. The cattle grazed peacefully, but there was an emptiness to the scene that made the hair on his neck stand up. Still, he'd pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was just the nervousness of a new beginning, the way a man feels when he's about to step into a life he's never lived before. Now, sitting on the porch steps while the three widows prepared what they called a welcome feast inside his house, Émile wondered if his grandfather's stories had left out the part about some places being haunted, not by ghosts, but by the living who refused to let go. Through the window, he could hear the clatter of pots and pans, the murmur of voices discussing what sounded suspiciously like wedding plans. The deed in his pocket felt heavier with each passing moment, and he began to understand that owning land and controlling it were two very different things. Inside the house that was no longer quite his own, Émile sat at a kitchen table that groaned under the weight of the feast the sisters had prepared. Bernadette carved slices from a roast the size of a small calf, while Marguerite ladled stew that could feed an army. Céleste poured coffee from a pot that seemed to hold enough for half the territory. Everything about these women operated on a scale that defied normal proportions, including their assumption that he would simply accept his fate as their collective husband. "Our husbands were the Thornfield brothers," Bernadette explained between bites that would have satisfied a hungry cowhand. "Jacques, Pierre, and Henri. Good men, strong men, but not substantial men, if you catch my meaning." She gestured to her own imposing frame with a laugh that shook the windows. "We Cartier sisters, that was our maiden name. We come from hardy stock. Our papa was French-Canadian, worked the logging camps. Our mama was Cheyenne, could track a whisper through a blizzard. We needed men who could match our appetites." Marguerite, her red hair catching the lamplight like flames, leaned forward with eyes that held depths of grief and determination. They tried their best, bless their hearts. But when the mine supervisor came looking for workers to blast deeper into that cursed mountain, our men felt they had to prove themselves. Had to show they could provide for wives like us. Her voice broke slightly, and for a moment, the fierce mask slipped to reveal the pain underneath. "We told them it was dangerous. Told them the mountain had been groaning, shifting. But pride makes men deaf to wisdom." Celeste's contribution was quieter, but no less intense. She reached across the table and placed her massive hand over Émile's, completely engulfing it. 27 men went into that mine the morning of the collapse. Only 8 came out, and none of them were ours. The townfolk came with shovels and prayers, but after 3 days, she shook her head, dark eyes glistening. The preacher said some words over the sealed entrance. The mining company paid out what they called compensation, and everyone expected us to pack up and move on like good little widows. "But this land remembers," Bernadette continued, her voice taking on an almost mystical quality. "Every fence post our husbands set, every room they added to this house, every calf they helped birth, it's all still here, waiting. We can't leave because they're still here, in the earth, in the walls, in the wind that whistles through the barn at night. And now you've come, sent by fate or providence or just plain luck. A man alone, looking for a home. Well, mister, you found more than a home." Émile felt the weight of their combined gaze like a physical pressure against his chest. These weren't just 3 grieving women trying to hold on to the past. They were forces of nature, mountains themselves that had decided he was going to be their foundation. The rational part of his mind screamed that he should ride away immediately, deed or no deed. But looking into their eyes, seeing the mixture of loss and hope and desperate determination, he found himself wondering if running from these women would be just another kind of cowardice. Another failure to add to his growing collection. The next morning, Émile rode into Cedar Falls with the uncomfortable sensation of being a man walking toward his own trial. Word had already spread, somehow it always did in small towns, that the Cartier sisters had claimed the new ranch owner. The stares he received ranged from sympathetic to amused to outright envious, depending on the observer's perspective on marriage, widowhood, and the general unpredictability of life on the frontier. At Morrison's General Store, the proprietor, a thin man named Augustus, who looked like he'd been stretched on a rack, leaned across the counter with the eager expression of someone about to share particularly juicy gossip. "Heard you met the Thornfield widows," he said, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Course, we all figured something like this might happen when we heard a single man had bought their place. Those gals aren't the type to just fade away into the sunset, if you catch my meaning." Behind him, two elderly women whispered behind their hands while pretending to examine bolts of fabric. One of them, Mrs. Abernathy, according to the introduction Augustus provided, stepped forward with the authority of someone who considered herself the town's moral compass. "Young man, I hope you understand the position you're in. Those women have been alone for months now, and grief can make people unpredictable. Some might say you have a Christian duty to help them, but others might warn you that some burdens are too heavy for one man to bear." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Father Miguel, a priest whose weathered face spoke of decades ministering to miners, ranchers, and the various souls who washed up in frontier towns seeking redemption or escape. His expression was thoughtful as he studied Émile, clearly weighing whatever he'd heard against what he observed. "I knew the Thornfield brothers," he said simply. "Good men, devoted to their wives, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Marriage is a sacrament, Mr. Rousseau. It cannot be entered into lightly or under duress, no matter how well-meaning the parties involved." The door chimed as Sheriff Beaumont entered, a man whose size suggested he might be related to the Cartier sisters himself. His badge caught the morning light as he approached, boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Émile, isn't it? Heard you've got yourself a situation out at the Thornfield place. Now, I want you to know that if you feel threatened or coerced in any way, the law can protect you. Those women are grieving, but that doesn't give them the right to force a man into anything he doesn't want." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, a reminder that civilization, however thin, still held sway in Cedar Falls. But as Émile listened to their well-meaning advice and thinly veiled warnings, he found himself thinking not of escape routes or legal protections, but of the way Céleste's eyes had filled with tears when she spoke of her husband, or how Bernadette's fierce exterior cracked when she mentioned the prayers that had gone unanswered. These people saw the Cartier sisters as a problem to be solved or avoided. But Émile was beginning to understand that they were something else entirely. Survivors clinging to the wreckage of their former lives, reaching for anything that might help them build something new from the ruins. That evening, as Émile returned to what was supposedly his ranch, he found the three sisters waiting on the porch again, but this time their demeanor had shifted. Gone was the forceful declaration of the morning. Instead, they sat quietly, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Bernadette held a cup of coffee that steamed in the cooling air, while Marguerite worked on mending what looked like a shirt far too small for any of them. Céleste simply sat, her enormous hands folded in her lap, staring at something only she could see. The silence stretched until Bernadette spoke without looking at him. "Townfolk been filling your ears with warnings, I expect." Her voice carried none of the commanding thunder from earlier. Instead, it held the weariness of someone who had fought too many battles and won too few. "Telling you we're crazy with grief, that you should run while you still can. Maybe they're right. Maybe we are a little crazy. Losing 3 men at once does things to a person's mind." Marguerite looked up from her mending, and Émile was surprised to see tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "Do you know what it's like, Mr. Rousseau, to wake up every morning expecting to hear your husband's voice calling from the barn, only to remember that voice is buried under a mountain of rock? To cook supper for 4 and realize you're setting too many places? To lie in a bed meant for 2 and feel like you're drowning in all that empty space?" Céleste finally turned toward him, and her dark eyes held depths of loneliness that made Émile's chest ache. "We're not asking you to love us the way you'd love a wife you chose. We know that's not possible, not right away. Maybe not ever. But this ranch needs a man's hands, and we need to know we're not just ghosts haunting a place that used to matter. We need to feel useful again, needed, like we serve some purpose beyond just taking up space in a world that's moved on without our husbands." The honesty in their voices hit Émile harder than any threat or demand could have. These weren't predators trying to trap him. They were 3 women drowning in grief and grasping for anything that might help them float. He thought of his own empty nights. The way silence could become a physical weight, the desperate hunger for human connection that had driven him west in the first place. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked quietly, surprising himself with the question. Bernadette's eyes met his directly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her expression held vulnerability instead of fierce determination. "A partnership. You work the ranch, make the decisions about cattle and crops and such. We keep house, cook, tend the garden, help with whatever needs doing. And at night—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks despite her bold words. "At night, none of us have to lie alone in the dark, remembering what we've lost. It's not conventional, and it's sure not what any of us planned for our lives. But it's honest work, honest companionship, and maybe that's enough to build something on." 2 weeks into what the sisters had begun calling their trial arrangement, Émile discovered that managing a ranch with 3 widows was like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician played a different song. Bernadette approached every task like a military campaign, organizing tools and schedules with the precision of a general. Marguerite threw herself into work with a fury that suggested she was trying to exhaust her grief through sheer physical effort. Céleste moved through her duties with quiet efficiency, but Émile often caught her staring at empty spaces as if expecting someone to fill them. The first real test came when a spring storm rolled down from the mountains with the violence that only nature could muster. Rain lashed the valley in sheets while lightning turned the sky into a battlefield of light and shadow. The creek that had seemed so peaceful began to rise, threatening the lower pasture where the best breeding stock grazed. Émile fought his way through the storm toward the barn, intending to saddle his horse and move the cattle to higher ground alone, but found all 3 women already there, dressed in oilskins and looking grimly determined. "You'll need help," Bernadette shouted over the thunder, leading her massive draft horse from its stall. The animal looked like it could pull a house off its foundation, which was probably close to the truth. "That's 40 head of prime cattle, and the creek's rising faster than Sunday prayers. One man alone won't get them moved in time." Before Émile could object, all 3 sisters were mounted and ready. Their horses selected not for elegance, but for the kind of stubborn strength that could work through hell itself. What followed was 2 hours of the hardest riding Émile had ever experienced. The cattle, spooked by the storm and reluctant to leave familiar ground, scattered like leaves in the wind. But the sisters moved with the coordination of women who had worked together their entire adult lives, anticipating each other's actions, communicating through gestures when words were lost to the wind. Marguerite's horse cut through the herd like a knife through butter, while Céleste's calm presence seemed to settle the most panicked animals. Bernadette rode like she was leading a cavalry charge, her voice somehow carrying over the storm as she directed their movements. When the last cow was safely on high ground and they all stood in the barn shaking water from their clothes, Émile felt something shift in his understanding of the arrangement. These weren't just 3 women clinging to the past. They were partners who had earned their place through competence and determination. Bernadette handed him a dry shirt, while Marguerite built up the fire, and Céleste prepared coffee that steamed like salvation in the cold air. "Still think you can work this ranch alone?" Bernadette asked with a grin that held no mockery, only the satisfaction of work well done. That night, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal that tasted better for having been earned through shared struggle, Émile found himself telling them about the mine accident that had driven him west. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. He told them about the men who had trusted his judgment, about the cave-in that had happened despite his careful calculations, about the way guilt had eaten at him until he could barely look at himself in a mirror. When he finished, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who understood that some burdens could only be carried by sharing them. The sound of approaching horses drew them to the front windows 3 weeks later, and what Émile saw made his blood run cold. 6 men rode in formation toward the house, their clothes marking them as neither cowboys nor townspeople. These were the kind of men who solved problems with violence first and questions later, if questions came at all. At their head rode a man Émile recognized from the mining camps, Dutch Morrison, a foreman known for treating workers like disposable equipment and considering himself above any law that interfered with profit. "Well, well," Dutch called out as the group reined in at the porch, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "Heard there was some dispute about ownership of this property. Thought we'd ride out and see how things were settling." His eyes moved over the sisters with the calculating look of a man appraising livestock, and Émile felt anger rise in his chest like a physical heat. Seems like there might be some confusion about who belongs where. Bernadette stepped onto the porch with the kind of calm that preceded storms, her sisters flanking her like sentries. No confusion here, Dutch. This is our home. And this is our husband. The word carried weight when she said it, as if saying it aloud had made something real that had only been potential before. Unless you have legal business here, I suggest you and your boys move along before you wear out what little welcome you might have had. One of Dutch's men, a thin scarecrow with yellowed teeth, laughed with the kind of sound that made decent people want to reach for weapons. Husband. Which one of you freaks is he married to? Or maybe you're sharing him like everything else. The words hung in the air like poison, and Émile saw Marguerite's hand move toward the rifle propped against the porch rail. The tension ratcheted up another notch as Dutch raised his hand to silence his man, his attention focused entirely on Émile. See, Mr. Rousseau, there's been some concern in town about your situation here. Some folks think maybe you're being held against your will, forced into an arrangement that ain't natural or proper. Now, I'm prepared to offer you a way out. You sign over the deed to these ladies, take this bag of gold for your trouble, and ride away. Clean, simple, and nobody gets hurt. His smile never reached his eyes, and Émile understood that the offer was really a threat dressed up in reasonable words. Émile stepped forward, positioning himself between Dutch's men and the sisters, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that mirrored the sheriff's from town. I appreciate your concern, Dutch, but as you can see, I'm here of my own free will. This is my ranch, these are my wives, and you're trespassing on my land. I'll give you to the count of 10 to turn those horses around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. The words surprised him with their firmness, and he realized that somewhere in the past weeks, he had stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement and started thinking of it as home. Dutch's face darkened at Émile's words, the pretense of reasonableness falling away like a discarded mask. That's unfortunate, Mr. Rousseau. See, the mining company has been looking to expand operations in this valley, and this ranch sits on some very promising geological formations. We were hoping to settle this peacefully, but if you're determined to be difficult, he gestured to his men, who spread out in a semicircle that spoke of practiced intimidation tactics. What happened next unfolded with the deadly precision of a clock striking midnight. Marguerite's rifle came up to her shoulder in one fluid motion, the barrel trained on Dutch's chest with unwavering steadiness. Céleste moved to the side of the porch, her position giving her a clear line of sight to 3 of the men while keeping the house's corner as cover. Bernadette simply crossed her arms and smiled. But it was the kind of smile that suggested she was looking forward to the coming violence. Now, boys, she said conversationally, I want you to think real careful about your next move. See, my sisters and I have been hunting and protecting this land since before most of you learned to walk upright. Marguerite there once dropped a charging bear at 200 yards in a blizzard. Céleste can put 3 shots through a silver dollar at 50 paces. And me? Her smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white in the afternoon light. Well, I just enjoy the work. Émile found himself oddly calm as he drew his own pistol, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. He'd never considered himself a violent man, but standing there with the sisters at his back and Dutch's men spread before them, he understood that some lines could only be drawn in blood. You've got one chance to leave peacefully, he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. After that, we let the land decide who belongs here. The standoff stretched like a wire under tension, each side measuring the other's resolve. Dutch's confidence began to waver as he realized that his overwhelming numbers meant nothing if the first shot fired would likely put him in the ground. His men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that intimidating townsfolk was very different from facing 3 armed women who had nothing left to lose, and a man who had found something worth protecting. The sound of a distant church bell drifted across the valley, marking the hour with a solemnity that made the moment feel like a funeral waiting to happen. Finally, Dutch raised his hand in a gesture that was half surrender, half threat. This isn't over, Rousseau. The mining company doesn't give up easy, and there are other ways to solve problems than face-to-face confrontations. You might want to remember that when you're lying in your bed at night, wondering what sounds normal and what might be something else entirely. He wheeled his horse around with theatrical flair, his men following in a departure that managed to seem both retreat and promise of future trouble. That evening, as they cleaned and checked their weapons by lamplight, the kitchen felt different, charged with the electricity that comes after people have stood together against a common threat. Émile watched the sisters move with the easy coordination of soldiers who had just survived their first battle together, and he realized that what had started as an arrangement of convenience had become something deeper and more dangerous. "Dutch won't give up," Marguerite said matter-of-factly, as she ran an oiled cloth down her rifle's barrel. "Mining companies are like wolves. They don't stop circling until they get what they want or something bigger and meaner chases them off. We'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." Her red hair caught the lamplight as she worked, and Émile was struck by how beautiful she looked when focused on something she understood completely. Céleste looked up from loading cartridges, her dark eyes thoughtful. "They'll try to divide us first, spread rumors in town, maybe try to bribe someone to cause trouble. Men like Dutch Morrison think every problem can be solved with enough money or enough fear." She paused, studying Émile with an intensity that made him feel transparent. "The question is whether you're ready for what standing with us really means. This isn't just about marriage anymore, it's about war." Bernadette set down her pistol and leaned back in her chair, which creaked under her substantial weight. "Our husbands tried to fight the mining company through legal channels, went to lawyers, filed papers, followed every proper procedure they could find. And where did it get them? Buried under a mountain because they trusted that good men doing honest work would be protected by honest laws." Her voice carried the bitterness of someone who had learned that justice was a luxury that poor people couldn't afford. Émile found himself thinking about the deed in his jacket pocket, the piece of paper that had started this whole situation. What if we gave them what they wanted, sold the ranch, split the money, started over somewhere else? The words felt like betrayal, even as he spoke them. But he had to know if flight was still an option, if there was a way to avoid the storm that was clearly building on the horizon. The silence that followed his question was deeper than any they had shared before. Finally, Bernadette reached across the table and placed her massive hand over his, her touch surprisingly gentle for someone so physically imposing. "You can leave anytime you want, Émile. We all know that. But if you stay, it has to be because you choose to stay, not because you're trapped or scared or sorry for us. The mining company killed our husbands for this land. If we run now, their deaths meant nothing. If we fight, we might lose everything, but at least we'll lose it as ourselves." Her eyes held depths of determination that made Émile understand that for these women, retreat had never been an option. Word of the confrontation spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, and within days the town had divided into camps as clearly as if battle lines had been drawn down Main Street. Some saw the sisters as grieving women who deserved sympathy and support in their time of need. Others viewed them as unnatural creatures who had somehow bewitched a decent man into an unseemly arrangement. The mining company, meanwhile, began applying pressure through every available channel. Father Miguel arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, his weathered face grave with concern. The bishop received a letter, he said without preamble, accepting the coffee Céleste offered but leaving it untouched on the table. "Questions about the validity of any marriage ceremony I might perform. Suggestions that I might be overstepping my authority in sanctioning an arrangement that goes against church doctrine." His eyes moved between Émile and the sisters with the careful neutrality of a man trying to balance earthly politics with heavenly obligations. Sheriff Beaumont followed the next day, his badge catching the morning light as he stood uncomfortably in their kitchen. Judge Morrison, Dutch's cousin, though he'll deny any influence, has been asking questions about the legality of your land ownership. Something about proper transfer procedures and whether the original sale was conducted according to territorial law. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not saying he has grounds for anything, but judges have been known to find technicalities when the right pressure gets applied." The economic pressure began almost immediately. Morrison's general store suddenly found itself unable to stock the supplies the ranch needed, citing shipping problems and inventory shortages. The bank questioned the legitimacy of Émile's accounts, demanding additional documentation that seemed to change every time he provided what they requested. Even the blacksmith developed a sudden reluctance to shoe their horses, claiming his schedule was too full to accommodate new work. But for every door that closed, another opened in unexpected ways. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman who had warned Émile about the sisters, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and a determined expression that brooked no argument. "Don't care what folks are saying about your arrangement," she declared, while unloading sacks of flour and bags of sugar. "What I care about is that the mining company thinks it can push around decent people. My late husband fought in the war to preserve the Union, and I'll be damned if I let some corporate bullies tear apart what he died to protect." Other support came from equally unexpected sources. A group of Chinese miners, ostracized by most of the town but possessing skills with explosives and tunnel construction that the sisters might need, offered their services in exchange for protection from the company's hired enforcers. 3 Mexican families, struggling to maintain their small farms against the same corporate pressure, proposed an alliance of mutual aid and shared resources. Even some of the working miners began stopping by, bringing news of the company's plans and warnings about which supervisors could be trusted and which were bought and paid for. The first real blow came on a moonless night in late June, when fire bloomed like a deadly flower against the darkness of their hay barn. Émile woke to Bernadette's voice cutting through his dreams like a blade, shouting words that turned his blood to ice water. By the time they reached the barn with buckets and wet blankets, half the winter's feed was already consumed by flames that danced with malicious joy against the star-filled sky. They fought the fire with the desperate fury of people who understood that losing the barn meant losing everything. Céleste organized a bucket brigade from the creek, while Marguerite used her horse to drag burning hay bales away from the main structure. Bernadette wielded a wet blanket like a weapon, beating down flames with the single-minded determination of someone fighting for her life. Émile found himself working alongside neighbors he'd never met, Chinese miners and Mexican farmers, and even some of the company workers who had come running when they saw the glow against the mountains. When dawn finally broke over the smoldering ruins, they had saved the barn's frame and most of the tools, but winter feed for 40 head of cattle had gone up in smoke. Worse than the immediate loss was the message the fire sent: that the mining company could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning or mercy. As they stood among the blackened timbers, exhausted and covered in soot, Sheriff Beaumont arrived to survey the damage with the careful expression of a man who knew more than he could say. "No witnesses, I suppose," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "No evidence of how the fire started, no strangers seen in the area. Just one of those unfortunate accidents that seem to happen when people make themselves unpopular with the wrong folks." His tone held sympathy, but also the resignation of someone who understood the limits of law when it came up against money and influence. Dutch Morrison rode up as the sheriff was leaving, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He surveyed the damage with the satisfied expression of someone admiring his own handiwork, then turned to Émile with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Terrible shame about your barn. Of course, if you'd taken my offer when it was on the table, you wouldn't be standing here counting losses. But don't worry, I'm a reasonable man. The offer still stands, though the price might have to be adjusted to account for depreciation." Bernadette stepped forward with the kind of calm that preceded avalanches, her massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Dutch and his smug satisfaction. "You know what I think started this fire, Dutch? I think it was spontaneous combustion. All that hot air you've been blowing around the valley finally found something dry enough to catch." Her voice held the promise of violence wrapped in conversational tones. "You might want to be careful about that. Hot air has a way of spreading in unexpected directions, and you never know what might catch fire next." The attack on their barn galvanized the opposition in ways that Dutch Morrison clearly hadn't anticipated. Within a week, the ranch had become the unofficial headquarters for what folks began calling the Anti-Company Coalition, a loose alliance of miners, farmers, small business owners, and anyone else who had grown tired of being pushed around by corporate interests that treated the valley like their personal property. Chen Wei, the leader of the Chinese miners, arrived with a proposal that was both practical and dangerous. "We build tunnels," he said in careful English, unrolling hand-drawn maps on their kitchen table. "Company thinks they control surface, but underground belongs to whoever knows how to work in darkness. We dig escape routes, storage areas, maybe even ways to reach their operations when they're not expecting visitors. His weathered hands traced paths through the valley that would turn the landscape into a maze of hidden passages. Maria Santos, matriarch of the largest Mexican farming family, brought news that was both encouraging and terrifying. My cousin works in the company office in Denver. They're planning something big, bigger than just buying your ranch. They want to strip mine the entire valley, from Cedar Falls to the mountain pass. Your land is just the first piece they need to make it legal. Her dark eyes held the knowledge of someone who had seen this pattern before, in Mexico, in California, anywhere that poor people sat on top of rich resources. The evening discussions that followed were unlike anything Émile had experienced in his previous life. Strategy sessions that blended the tactical knowledge of former soldiers with the practical wisdom of people who had spent their lives working the land. Maps and plans spread across tables while children played in corners and women mended clothes by lamplight. It felt like the birth of something new, not just resistance to the mining company, but a different way of organizing life itself. Father Miguel surprised everyone by arriving with a declaration that changed the legal landscape overnight. "I've consulted with the bishop and with canon law," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had wrestled with questions of faith and politics and emerged with clarity. The church recognizes marriages made under extraordinary circumstances, including arrangements designed to protect widows and preserve family properties. If Mr. Rousseau and the sisters wish to formalize their union, I am prepared to perform a ceremony that will be legally binding under both territorial and church law. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications that extended far beyond personal relationships. A legally recognized marriage would strengthen their claim to the land while making it much harder for the company to challenge their right to be there. But it would also mean crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, committing to something that had started as convenience and grown into something none of them fully understood. As they looked at each other across the kitchen table, Émile realized that the next word spoken would determine not just their immediate future, but the kind of people they were choosing to become. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in late July, with the entire coalition gathered in the meadow behind the ranch house. Father Miguel had suggested the outdoor setting, reasoning that if God could bless unions anywhere, he might appreciate the honesty of vows spoken under the sky he had created. The altar was nothing more than a wooden table covered with wildflowers, but the solemnity of the moment transformed the simple meadow into something sacred. Émile stood waiting in his best suit, feeling simultaneously like he was about to make the most important decision of his life, and like he was watching someone else's story unfold. The sisters approached together, wearing dresses that Mrs. Abernathy and her sewing circle had crafted especially for the occasion. Bernadette's dress was deep blue, the color of mountain lakes, while Marguerite wore green that matched the summer grass. Céleste had chosen yellow, bright as sunshine against her dark hair. They looked magnificent and terrifying and beautiful all at once. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. Father Miguel had crafted special vows that acknowledged the unique nature of their arrangement while maintaining the sacred aspects of traditional marriage. Do you, Émile Rousseau, take these women as your wives, to honor and protect, to work alongside and stand with, in times of prosperity and times of trial? His voice carried across the meadow, with the gravity of someone binding souls together before God and witnesses. When Émile said, "I do," the words felt heavier than any he had ever spoken. But when each sister repeated their own vows, promising to stand together, to share the burdens and joys of building something new, to honor their collective commitment while maintaining their individual strength, he understood that they were creating something unprecedented. Not just a marriage, but a new form of family that challenged every assumption about how people were supposed to organize their lives. The celebration that followed was a mixture of wedding feast and war council, with children running between tables laden with food contributed by every family in the coalition. Chenway's miners performed a traditional dragon dance using a dragon they had constructed from ranch materials, while Maria Santos led the women in songs that had been sung at Mexican weddings for generations. Even some of the company workers who had grown disgusted with Dutch Morrison's tactics showed up with gifts and good wishes, though they kept looking over their shoulders as if expecting trouble. As the sun set and the last guests departed, Émile found himself alone with his 3 wives on the porch where this whole adventure had begun. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had just committed to something larger than themselves and were taking a moment to absorb the magnitude of what they had done. "So," Bernadette said finally, her voice soft with wonder and exhaustion, "I guess we're really married now." The statement hung in the air like a question, and when they all started laughing, Émile realized that happiness, like love, could take forms that no one had ever thought to name. Their wedding night was interrupted by the sound of explosions echoing across the valley, followed by the orange glow of fires that painted the darkness in shades of hell. The mining company had chosen the night of their marriage to launch a coordinated attack on every member of the coalition, striking simultaneously at Chinese mining camps, Mexican farms, and the businesses in town that had shown support for the ranch. Émile and the sisters were dressed and armed within minutes, their celebration clothes abandoned for the practical gear of people preparing for war. Through the telescope that Chen Wei had provided, they could see groups of riders moving between the burning buildings like demons dancing through flames. The attacks were too coordinated to be random violence. This was Dutch Morrison's answer to their defiance, a message written in fire and blood that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. "They're trying to divide us," Marguerite observed as she checked her rifle for the 3rd time. "Hit everyone at once so we can't coordinate a response, make each group think they're fighting alone." Her tactical assessment was coldly accurate, and Émile found himself grateful for whatever military experience her late husband had shared with her. But they made one mistake. They told us where they are by lighting themselves up like Christmas trees. What followed was the strangest military campaign in the history of Colorado Territory. Using Chen Wei's tunnels, small groups of defenders moved through the valley like ghosts, appearing where the company forces least expected them and disappearing before superior numbers could be brought to bear. Celeste's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to set ambushes that turned the attackers' confidence into confusion, while Bernadette's tactical leadership coordinated strikes that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The turning point came when they reached the Chinese camp and found Chen Wei organizing a defense that was part fortress construction, part engineering marvel. His people had used their mining expertise to create a network of tunnels and trenches that turned their small settlement into a maze where every wrong turn led to carefully prepared crossfire. "Company thinks Chinese are just workers," Chen Wei said with grim satisfaction as explosions rocked the night around them. "They forget we built railroads through mountains, fought wars in valleys they never heard of. We know how to make Earth fight for us." By dawn, the company's coordinated attack had turned into a rout. Dutch Morrison's men found themselves scattered across a valley where every hill might hide snipers, every creekbed might conceal fighters, and every building might explode without warning. The mining company had superior numbers and equipment, but the coalition had something more valuable: intimate knowledge of the land they were fighting for, and the desperate courage of people with nowhere left to run. As the sun rose over the smoke-scarred valley, it illuminated a landscape where the balance of power had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. The morning after the battle revealed the true cost of their victory. 3 Chinese miners had died defending their camp, while 2 Mexican farmers lay buried under the ruins of a barn that had been their life's work. In town, Morrison's general store was a blackened shell, and the church where Father Miguel had officiated their wedding bore scars from bullets and fire that would take months to repair. But the human cost was measured in more than just bodies. Mrs. Abernathy sat on the steps of her ruined store, staring at the destruction with the blank expression of someone whose world had been torn apart by forces beyond her understanding. Several families had already loaded their possessions into wagons, preparing to flee a valley that had become too dangerous for ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. Dutch Morrison himself had vanished sometime during the night, along with most of his hired guns. Sheriff Beaumont found his abandoned horse near the mountain pass, but the man himself had disappeared like smoke on the wind. "He'll be back," the sheriff warned as they surveyed the damage in town. "Men like Dutch don't give up. They just change tactics. And next time, he'll bring more men. Better weapons. Maybe even territorial troops if he can convince the governor that you're all dangerous insurgents." The victory had also revealed divisions within their own coalition that success had temporarily papered over. Some of the Mexican families wanted to use their newfound military strength to drive all the company's supporters out of the valley, while Chen Wei's miners pushed for a more systematic campaign to destroy the company's mining operations throughout the territory. The sisters found themselves in the unexpected position of moderating between allies who saw the battle as the beginning of a larger war. "We fought to protect our homes," Bernadette reminded the coalition leaders during a tense meeting in their bullet-scarred kitchen. "If we turn into the same kind of people who attacked us, what exactly did we win?" Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much violence and understood that every victory came with costs that couldn't be calculated in advance. "The mining company wants us to become killers and raiders because that makes it easier for them to justify whatever they do to us next." Émile found himself thinking about the man he had been when he first arrived in the valley. Someone running from responsibility, from the consequences of decisions that had cost other people their lives. Now he was married to 3 remarkable women, leading a coalition of people who trusted him with their safety and facing choices that would determine whether their victory led to lasting peace or escalating violence. The irony wasn't lost on him that, in trying to escape his past, he had found a future that demanded even more of him than anything he had left behind. 2 weeks later, Dutch Morrison returned with a force that dwarfed his previous efforts. Federal marshals rode alongside hired guns and company security, their badges providing legal cover for what amounted to a small army. At their head rode a man Émile recognized from wanted posters. Jake Coltrane, a mercenary who specialized in putting down labor disputes and land conflicts with maximum violence and minimum questions. The official warrant they carried accused the coalition of sedition, conspiracy against territorial authority, and destruction of private property. But the real message was simpler. Surrender immediately, or face the full weight of federal law backed by overwhelming force. "You have until noon to turn over the ringleaders," Coltrane announced from the Valley Road, his voice carrying across the morning air with the authority of someone accustomed to delivering ultimatums. "After that, we start burning everything that moves." The coalition faced an impossible choice. They could fight and almost certainly lose, given the marshals' superior numbers and legal authority. They could surrender their leaders and hope the rest would be left alone, though everyone knew that hope was probably naive. Or they could try something unprecedented, something that would either save them all or destroy them more completely than any military defeat. "We call their bluff," Céleste said quietly as they huddled in the kitchen that had become their war room. Not with guns this time, but with law. Real law, not the company's bought and paid for version. Her dark eyes held a determination that made Émile's chest tight with pride and fear. "Father Miguel has connections in Denver, maybe even Washington. Chen Wei's people have been sending letters to California about what's happening here. Maria's cousin works for a newspaper that's been looking for a story about corporate abuse." What followed was the most desperate gamble any of them had ever attempted. While Coltrane's men waited for their noon deadline, riders galloped toward Cedar Falls carrying messages that would either bring salvation or accelerate their destruction. Father Miguel rode for the territorial capital with documents proving the mining company's illegal tactics. Chen Wei's fastest rider headed for the Chinese community in Denver with evidence of the attacks on their camps. Maria Santos herself took the mountain trail toward the nearest telegraph office, carrying testimony that would reach newspapers in San Francisco and Chicago. As the sun climbed toward noon and Coltrane's men began checking their weapons, Émile stood on the porch with his 3 wives and wondered if their marriage would last longer than the day it had begun. "Whatever happens," Bernadette said, her massive hand finding his, "we made something real here, something worth fighting for." Her voice held no regret, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had lived according to her principles and was prepared to face the consequences. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them all reach for their weapons, but the riders who appeared carried not guns but newspapers and official documents. The territorial governor, facing pressure from federal investigators and newspaper editors who had suddenly taken interest in Colorado mining practices, had issued an emergency order suspending all company operations pending a full investigation. Coltrane's mercenaries found themselves facing not desperate farmers and miners, but representatives of legitimate authority who outranked them and weren't impressed by their threats. The investigation that followed turned the valley into a circus of lawyers, federal agents, newspaper reporters, and curious onlookers who came to see the place where a handful of farmers and miners had successfully challenged corporate power. The ranch house became an unofficial courthouse where testimonies were recorded, evidence was cataloged, and the truth slowly emerged from years of carefully constructed lies. Dutch Morrison, when finally located hiding in a Denver hotel, proved remarkably willing to testify against his former employers once he realized that cooperation might be the only thing standing between him and a long prison sentence. His revelations about the mining company's practices, bribery, intimidation, deliberate safety violations, and outright murder, filled newspapers across the country and prompted congressional hearings that would reshape territorial mining law. But the real transformation was in the people themselves. The coalition that had formed to resist the mining company evolved into something unprecedented, a cooperative community where Chinese miners worked alongside Mexican farmers, where former company workers learned new trades from master craftsmen, where decisions were made by consensus rather than corporate decree. The ranch that had started as Émile's escape from responsibility became the center of an experiment in democratic living that attracted visitors from as far away as Europe. The marriage itself had evolved as well, settling into patterns that surprised everyone, including the participants. Bernadette managed the ranch's business affairs with the same tactical brilliance she had shown in organizing their defense. Marguerite oversaw the agricultural operations, turning their fields into a model of innovative farming techniques that tripled their productivity. Céleste became the community's unofficial diplomat, her calm wisdom helping to resolve conflicts and integrate new families into their growing settlement. Émile found himself in the role of coordinator and representative, the public face of a community that was too complex and unconventional to be easily explained to outsiders. When reporters asked him to describe their marriage, he struggled to find words that captured the reality of four people who had found in each other something deeper than romantic love, a partnership based on shared purpose, mutual respect, and the hard-won understanding that some things were worth sacrificing everything to protect. The legal recognition of their marriage had opened doors to other unconventional arrangements throughout the territory. Other groups of widows had banded together to protect their properties. Immigrant families had formed cooperative marriages to combine resources and gain citizenship rights. Even some unmarried women had used the precedent to claim property rights that had previously been denied to them. The sisters' bold gamble had become a movement that was quietly reshaping the social landscape of the American frontier. Success brought its own challenges. The ranch that had once housed 4 people now supported nearly 30 families, with new buildings sprouting like wildflowers after rain. The original intimate dinner conversations had given way to community meetings that sometimes stretched past midnight as they debated everything from water rights to educational curricula for the growing number of children. The marriage that had started as a desperate arrangement now faced pressures that none of them had anticipated. Bernadette struggled with the loss of privacy that came with their public prominence, sometimes disappearing for days to hunt alone in the mountains when the constant attention became too much. Marguerite threw herself into expansion projects with an intensity that worried everyone, as if she could outrun her grief by staying busy enough to avoid thinking about it. Céleste had begun experiencing what she called dark spells, periods when the weight of their collective responsibilities seemed to crush her spirit, leaving her unable to speak or eat for days at a time. During these episodes, she would sit by the creek for hours, staring at water that reflected nothing back at her but her own exhaustion. Émile learned to recognize the signs and would sit with her in silence, offering the kind of presence that didn't require words or explanations. Their physical relationship had evolved as well, settling into patterns that defied every conventional understanding of marriage. Some nights, they all shared the large bedroom they had constructed specifically for their unusual arrangement, finding comfort in simple closeness after difficult days. Other times, the emotional needs of one or another required private attention that the others provided without jealousy or resentment. It was an intimacy based more on emotional generosity than physical passion, though passion had its place as well. The arrival of a federal marriage commission in the fall brought new complications. Government officials, responding to pressure from religious groups and traditional marriage advocates, had come to investigate whether their arrangement violated federal laws about polygamy and moral conduct. The legal questions were complex, made more so by the precedents their marriage had established and the political implications of any decision the commission might make. "They want to make us an example," Father Miguel warned during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the ranch. "Either as proof that unconventional arrangements can work within legal frameworks, or as cautionary tales about what happens when people challenge traditional institutions." His weathered face showed the strain of defending their marriage to church authorities who were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the attention it was attracting. The commission hearings, held in the Cedar Falls courthouse, became a media spectacle that drew observers from across the country. Émile found himself testifying not just about his own marriage, but about the nature of love itself, the meaning of family, and the question of whether government had the right to dictate how consenting adults organize their private lives. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just for their own future, but for every unconventional family that had formed in the wake of their example. The commission's decision came on a gray December morning when snow lay thick across the valley and the mountains stood like silent judges against the winter sky. Federal Marshal Thompson, who had conducted the investigation with surprising fairness despite obvious political pressure, read the verdict in a voice that carried the weight of precedent being set for generations to come. After extensive investigation and testimony, this commission finds that the marriage of Émile Rousseau to Bernadette, Marguerite, and Céleste Thornfield was entered into freely by all parties, serves legitimate social and economic purposes, and violates no federal statutes currently in force. The words hung in the cold air like crystallized breath, each syllable carrying implications that would ripple through territorial law for decades. Furthermore, the Commission recommends that territorial authorities recognize similar arrangements where they serve to protect widows, orphans, or other vulnerable populations. The celebration that followed was subdued, marked more by relief than joy. They had won a victory that legitimized their choices, but everyone understood that legal recognition was just the beginning of a longer struggle for social acceptance. In towns across the territory, traditional families were already organizing opposition to what they saw as an assault on Christian marriage and proper moral order. But the real test came 3 days later, when a rider arrived with news that turned their triumph into potential tragedy. A fire had swept through Chen Wei's mining operation, trapping 6 men in tunnels that had become their tomb. The mining company, despite the federal investigation and legal restrictions, had secretly resumed operations using safety shortcuts that the Chinese miners had been forced to accept or lose their jobs entirely. The rescue operation that followed tested every skill they had learned and every alliance they had built. Émile found himself descending into tunnels that groaned with the weight of unstable rock, while Bernadette coordinated surface operations with military precision. Marguerite used her knowledge of underground water flows to identify safe passages, while Céleste worked with Maria Santos to organize medical care for the men they hoped to bring to the surface alive. For 18 hours, they fought against time, geology, and the company officials who tried to shut down their rescue efforts for safety reasons. When they finally broke through to the trapped miners, 4 were still alive, though badly injured and barely conscious from smoke inhalation. Chen Wei, despite a broken arm and severe burns, had kept his men organized and breathing by sharing water and maintaining the kind of calm leadership that turned survival from luck into skill. The successful rescue became a symbol that transcended their immediate community. Newspapers across the country carried stories about the cooperative effort that had saved lives through courage, skill, and the kind of mutual aid that made democracy more than just a political theory. The ranch that had started as one man's refuge from failure had become a beacon of what people could accomplish when they chose cooperation over competition, inclusion over exclusion. 5 years later, Émile stood on the same porch where he had first encountered the 3 sisters who would become his wives, watching their community celebrate the harvest festival that had become an annual tradition. The valley now supported over 200 families with schools, workshops, a hospital, and the kind of infrastructure that turned survival into prosperity. The children who ran between the festival booths represented every culture that had found refuge in their community. Chinese miners' daughters played with Mexican farmers' sons, while the children of former company workers learned traditional crafts from master artisans who had come from as far away as Germany and Ireland. The marriages that had formed following their example created family structures that bureaucrats still struggled to classify, but which functioned with the kind of practical love that made labels irrelevant. Bernadette had discovered an unexpected talent for business that had turned their agricultural surplus into trade relationships spanning the continent. Her negotiations with railroad companies and shipping concerns were conducted with the same tactical precision she had once applied to military operations, and her reputation for honest dealing had made their community a preferred partner for merchants who valued reliability over maximum profit. Marguerite's innovations in farming techniques had attracted attention from agricultural colleges and government agencies interested in sustainable land use. Her integration of traditional Mexican and Chinese farming methods with European crop rotation had tripled their yields while actually improving soil quality. She traveled frequently to share her knowledge with other communities, returning with new ideas and renewed enthusiasm for the work that had become her passion. Céleste had emerged as the community's unofficial philosopher and spiritual guide. Her dark spells transformed into a kind of wisdom that helped others navigate the complexities of unconventional living. Her counsel was sought by families struggling with everything from child-rearing to conflict resolution, and her quiet presence at community meetings often provided the calm center around which difficult decisions could be made. Their marriage had evolved into something that defied every conventional category. They were business partners, best friends, occasional lovers, and constant companions in an adventure that none of them could have imagined when it began. The physical intimacy that newspapers had sensationalized and critics had condemned had settled into patterns of affection and comfort that sustained them through difficulties that would have destroyed more traditional arrangements. As the sun set over the festival and families began the walk home to houses that represented every architectural tradition their residents had brought with them, Émile felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found not just love, but purpose. The guilt that had driven him west had been transformed into responsibility willingly accepted, shared with partners who understood that some burdens became lighter when carried together. "Still think you made the right choice?" Bernadette asked, settling her considerable bulk into the chair beside him, with a sigh of contentment that spoke of work well done and rest well earned. Behind them, through the kitchen window, they could hear Marguerite and Céleste discussing plans for next year's crops, their voices carrying the easy intimacy of women who had learned to build dreams together. Émile reached for her hand, still amazed after all these years by the gentleness possible in such strength. "I think," he said slowly, watching the last of the festival lights twinkle out across the valley that had become their world, "that sometimes the best choices are the ones that choose us." The words carried across the porch like a prayer of gratitude for all the unexpected gifts that came to those brave enough to say yes when life offered them something unprecedented. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound echoed off the mountains that had witnessed everything. The arrival of a lonely man seeking refuge, the courage of 3 women refusing to be erased, the formation of a community that proved love could take forms that no one had ever thought to legislate. As they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who had built something lasting, the stars emerged one by one, each point of light a reminder that even in the vast darkness of an uncertain world, some things burned bright enough to guide others home.